In 1764, a census of Westford recorded 0 Native Americans living in town. And yet, just 24 years later, a town record notes that the burial of an old Indian here in Westford happened. How can that be? Of course, the story doesn't begin in 1764. It stretches back thousands of years. But this episode is about how those who were here in the 1660s became lost from the ledger. I'm Leslie Howard of the Westford Historical Society and Museum, and this is Once Known. Today's episode, Lost from the Ledger, Westford's Indigenous History, is sponsored by Freedom's Way Inclusive Storytelling Partnership Grant. A quick note about language. In this episode, I use terms like Native American, Indigenous, and specific tribal names such as the Pennacook and the Massachusett, which are more accurate and respectful than the term Indian. That said, I do use the term praying Indians where historically appropriate. It was the name given in the 17th century to Native Americans who converted to Christianity and lived in mission towns like Natick. While the phrase may sound outdated today, I use it here in its historical context. This podcast will not cover the history of the Indigenous people prior to 1600s. There are many resources out there that cover that part of the history. I wanted to get into the written record of what actually happened to the people who occupied this land. Also, the only written sources of what happened were, of course, written by English settlers, and there is a clear bias that what they were doing was, quote, the right thing. This podcast aims to present a more complete and honest account, recognizing that even well-intentioned research is shaped by available sources and perspectives. The best primary sources are the reflections of Daniel Gookin, who was military and governmental supervisor of the Native Americans. He wrote 2 manuscripts which detail what he called the doings and sufferings of the Indigenous people of the area. He seemed to be well acquainted with many of them, and his writings, though biased, give us the best account of what happened. When I set out on this project, my goal was to create a cohesive narrative of the history of the Indigenous people that once lived on the land now known as Westford, and necessarily including Littleton, Chelmsford, and Groton. Figuring out who lived on this land is not as easy as choosing one tribe. The boundaries were fluid, and it was all a loosely defined group of Indigenous people living in the area. That's why maps like these are helpful. In 1600, one source reported that there were a minimum of 2,000 Pennacooks living in New England. In the Merrimack Valley, the Massachusett were dominant, as were the Pennacook that mostly occupied the Dawnlands of what we know as New Hampshire and Maine. On a smaller scale, the Pawtucket were prominent here. Breaking it down further, the label becomes Wamasett and the Neshoba Praying Indian villages. As for those who did not join the villages, they went elsewhere, joined with the Nipmuc or with the Pennacook. That record is lost. What we know are only fragments of the stories of those who remained. Religious mission work and the creation of the Indian praying villages were a major element of the Massachusetts Bay Company Charter from 1629. The charter states that the colonists should seek to, quote, win and incite the natives of the country to the knowledge and obedience of the only true God and Savior of mankind, and the Christian faith, which in our royal intention is the principal end of this plantation, end quote. The Reverend John Eliot had a ministry in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and in the late 1640s he began to study the Algonquin language and published a Bible in that language. He went to the various areas of Massachusetts, preached, and began to establish praying Indian villages. The first one was established in Natick in 1650. The praying villages of Wamasett and Neshoba were established as the 5th and 6th villages, respectively. Gookin tells us that there are about 75 people per village. Beginning in the 1640s, Indigenous people began to submit to the English government, meaning they handed over some of their autonomy in exchange for some protections. In some ways, it was a surrender to circumstances that seemed insurmountable. English settlers were taking over lands, sometimes buying it, and purchasing rights to fishing places when the Indigenous people did not fully understand the transaction that took place. When English purchased land, they considered that it was not a purchase from a small band of Indigenous people, but actually purchased from the entire tribe, thinking that the Indigenous people had a similar societal and governmental construct to the English. The Pennacook and Pawtucket traveled to the falls of the Merrimack River often, but it was not always a permanent and official residence the way the English considered it. This caused some confusion as tribes had a more fluid sense of land usage. Following the others, on June 20th, 1644, Passaconaway, the sachem of the Pennacooks, submitted to the English. As more and more land was being taken, and John Eliot continued to make visits, encouraging them to Christianize, the people saw the benefit in converting as a way to at least preserve some of their ancestral and spiritual sites. The Neshoba and Wamasett praying Indian villages weren't mixes of people, they were just one, existing tribes that just converted to praying villages. The Neshoba praying Indians were organized under Old Tehadawan. Some sources describe the Neshoba as Nipmuc, but Massachusetts is more likely, considering geography, and that Old Tehadawan was a sagamore of the Massachusetts royal line with its seat in Mascataquid, but the residence was in Neshoba. Neshoba Plantation was established in 1654 after Eliot petitioned the Great and General Court within the plantation land grant, and it was located near Nagog and Fort Pond. From its founding in 1654 until 1675, Neshoba was a relatively peaceful place. As the dangers of King Philip's War encroached on the area and more English arrived, fear grew among the English settlers and the Neshoba. However, Eliot called Neshoba a place of much affliction. For their protection, using air quotes there, it was suggested that the Neshoba be removed to Deer Island in Boston Harbor with the other indigenous people. However, due to overcrowding on Deer Island, the Neshoba were instead ordered to Concord and were taken in by John Hoare. 58 Neshoba praying Indians gathered enough food for 6 months and lived in the workhouse behind Hoare's estate. This estate eventually was purchased by the Alcotts and is now known as the Orchard House. The workhouse apparently still stands today. They lived and worked on the estate and kept to themselves. However, the townspeople were not happy with their presence, and in December 1676, petitioned to have the Neshoba removed to Deer Island. Hoare tried to protect them, but Captain Mosley, a rogue military officer with delusions of grandeur, broke down the door and marched the Neshoba off. The conditions on Deer Island were abhorrent, to say the least. Sickness and starvation were rampant. The English were willing to negotiate a return of the praying Indians out of the detention island in exchange for prisoners. Tom Doublet, a Neshoba, was among those released to act as an interpreter and facilitate a prisoner exchange. This happened at a garrison on Walter Powers's land, near the base of Neshoba Hill, on what we now call Powers Road. On May 12, 1676, the Neshoba praying Indians were released and went to Cambridge, and for some time also were in Charlestown. From there, some went to Natick, and others returned to Concord and lived under governmental supervision. Some served as servants to the English, and others returned to the Neshoba plantation. By the mid-1680s, the Neshoba were selling off parcels of their land to English settlers, including Thomas Henchman of Chelmsford. In 1702, the government wanted to confirm the purchase of Henchman's land, and he wrote that there were no longer any Neshoba living on the land. The 1702 provision meant that the deeds to buy Neshoba had to be settled, quote, conveniently. The House decided to approve the deeds on the condition that the space be set aside for any native individuals who chose to remain. In 1705, it was actually acknowledged that James Speen was a resident of Neshoba, and there was evidence that Tom Doublet and Sarah Doublet were also living there. As a result, in 1714, the Neshoba praying Indians had a 500-acre tract of land that became their new land and was given the name Indian Newtown. The remnants of the Neshoba plantation became the town Neshoba and then ultimately named Littleton. In contrast to the Neshoba, the Wamasets had a much more violent experience. John Eliot began his mission trips to the area in the early 1650s and in 1653 petitioned for a piece of land in present-day Lowell for the Pawtucket and Wamasett praying villages. And in 1655, the villages merged to become the Wamasett praying Indian village. Also in 1655, the town of Chelmsford was incorporated, and the settlers petitioned for a tract of land. to be purchased from the Wamasett praying Indians. This became known as the Wamasett Purchase. Some of the men whose names appeared on the list of purchasers included future Westford residents Solomon Keyes and Abraham Parker. A large portion of the Wamasett Purchase became Westford. This history is anything but simple, and I do not wish to suggest otherwise, but to simplify the story. Over the next several years, there were a series of land transfers as the Pennacook receded further and further into the Dawnlands. They often returned to fish in the Pawtucket Falls and the Merrimack River. In 1660, Passaconaway abdicated in favor of his son, Wanalancet, as sachem of the Pennacooks. Wanalancet likely lived farther north from our area, more towards the Muskeg Falls, but traveled to this area to fish. In the mid-1660s, tensions began to mount between the Pennacooks and the Wamasett praying Indians and with the English settlers. A few years later, Wanalancet converted to Christianity. Upon his conversion, he is reported to have said, "I must acknowledge I have all my days been used to pass in an old canoe, and now you exhort me to change and leave my old canoe, and embark in a new one, to which I have hitherto been unwilling. But now I yield up myself to your advice, and enter into a new canoe, and do engage to pray to God hereafter." This quote, regardless if it is verbatim, exemplifies a survival conversion rather than a spiritual conversion to Christianity. The English were fearful of the Indigenous people and sought to impose restrictions on them. For example, on August 30th, 1675, a council in Boston deemed it necessary to order the praying Indians, who were faithful to the English, to remain within 1 mile of the center of their village, except to hunt or gather corn, and then only with an Englishman. Ahead of King Philip's War, Chelmsford provided several garrison houses. One was Thomas Henchman's house in the northeast section of the town known as Middlesex Village. Another one was on Francis Hill, near Solomon Keyes' house, which had an excellent lookout to the settlements on Stony Brook. Wanalancet with the Pennacooks and the Wamasett withdrew from the lands near Wamasett in 1675, ahead of the onset of King Philip's War. In September 1675, Captain Moseley came upon the deserted Wamasett village and set fire to it. Shortly thereafter, Chelmsford resident Captain James Richardson's haystack was burned. Count Oakes believed the Wamasett to be at fault and rounded them up and marched them down to Boston for eventual deposit at Deer Island. 3 of them were sold into enslavement. A council in Boston found the Wamasett innocent of the arson, determining instead that it was a Narragansett, and said they could return. On their march back, though promised safe passage, they were attacked in Woburn. The Council of Massachusetts thought Wanalancet's move might be hostile, and on September 30th, 1675, ordered Lieutenant Thomas Henchman of Chelmsford to send messengers to find him, convince him of English friendship, and urge him to return. The messengers included William Fletcher, who was the grandfather of Deacon Joshua Fletcher of Westford, and his Pennacook, quote-unquote, servant, Wepakosset. In October, Wanalancet responded. The message back to the English reads in part, "To Mr. Thomas Henchman of Chelmsford, we cannot come home again. We go towards the French. We go where Wanalancet is. The reason is we went away from the English, for when there was any harm done in Chelmsford, they laid it to us and said we did it. But we know ourselves. We never did harm to the English, but we go away peaceably and quietly. But we are sorry the English have driven us from our praying to God and from our teacher. We did begin to understand a little of praying to God. We remember our love to Mr. Henchman and James Richardson." Tensions did not release, and Wanalancet had good reason to stay north. On November 15th, 1675, 14 armed men from Chelmsford resolved to go to the wigwams of the Wamasett Indians and kill them all. They called to the Wamasett to come out, and they did, not suspecting the English would harm them. But 2 of the English fired upon them and wounded 5 women and children, and killed a 12-year-old boy whose mother, Sarah Doublet, was also wounded. The other 12 men did not fire. The two perpetrators, determined to be men named Lorgan and Robbins, were subsequently arrested, placed in prison, and tried for the murders. Unfortunately and lamentably, they were acquitted due to an apparent lack of evidence. The Wamasett petitioned the government for a piece of land to which they might remove themselves for safety. The government said they would act, but it was not fast enough. The remaining Wamasett finally removed themselves to be with the Pennacook, except 6 or 7 of them who were not fit to make the trek to the Dawnlands. Not long after that, these remaining Wamasett were killed by Chelmsford residents. When Wanalancet received word that King Philip's War ended, he and his people returned to his land in July 1676 to find his cornfields taken over. The General Court ordered that Wanalancet and his people be placed under the guardianship of Colonel Jonathan Ting of Dunstable, who was paid £20 per year for this. They returned to live on Wickasaukee Island in the Merrimack River, their final numbers being 10 men and 50 women and children. This group formed the community that attempted to survive in the new English way of life. The women generally took to crafting and weaving, something that did not require land ownership. Many of the men, whose traditional roles were not easily translated into colonial society, often sought work as whalemen or went into the military service. Shortly after his return, Wanalancet called on Chelmsford Reverend John Fisk one day to inquire if his old allies and friends had suffered during the war. Reverend Fisk thanked God for sparing them and said they hadn't suffered much. Wanalancet reportedly told him that he should be thanked next. In 1677, the St. Francis Indians from Canada visited Wanalancet and asked them to unite. He and about 50 Wamasett joined. This left about 10 Wamasett in the area. After the relationship with the St. Francis Indians soured, Wanalancet returned to the Pennacook area. And then, in 1686, all of the Pennacooks remaining in Wamasett, Pawtucket, Nashua, Concord, Groton, Lancaster, Stowe, and Dunstable all sold their remaining land to Colonel Ting. They went to the north and northeast, rejoining the St. Francis Indians, probably finding safety in numbers. This implies that non-landowning Pennacook or Wamasett may have stayed and must have remained in the area. The names of those who remained were once known, but now lost to history. To tell the early history of Westford is also to tell the early history of several neighboring towns, because Westford was carved from parts of them. We've talked about the Neshoba of Littleton and the Wamasett in Chelmsford. Now we quickly turn to Groton. As we make this transition, one of the few native individuals named in the early records is Andrew, referred to in town documents simply as Andrew the Indian. In 1730, a triangular piece of land, most of what is now Forge Village, was transferred to Westford when Jonas Prescott, Ebenezer Townsend, and others wanted to join the church in Westford. Hodgman's History of Westford tells us of Andrew the Indian selling a fishing weir at Forge Pond. Over the last several years of doing deep dives into Westford's history, I found that while Hodgman certainly did his research, he rarely cites his sources and often leaves out specific details, like who was Andrew the Indian? What year did he sell the fishing weir? Who bought it? I paid a visit to the town clerk's office in Groton and searched through their early records. The women working there weren't quite sure why I needed to know about a fishing weir, but I continued on my quest. After some searching, I found my answer. In 1673, Groton records this: the 20 shillings due to Andrew the Indian from the town for his weir at Stony Brook, assigned by said Indian to Richard Blood. The said Richard Blood assigns it over to Lieutenant James Parker. So who was Andrew the Indian? I searched through several town histories and websites. Some sources label Andrew as a Neshoba, but I disagree. I believe Andrew was actually a member of the Massachusett praying Indians. One historian writes of a man, Andrew, who was part of this group. In 1654, Massachusett became the third of the praying villages in Massachusetts, and prior to 1675, they lived in Lancaster before moving to Marlborough for English protection. What happened to Andrew after he sold the weir? Andrew was on a fishing voyage near some lakes, and on his way home, about 1675, he fell in with King Philip's men. Andrew stayed with them because he was afraid to be found by the English and treat him as an enemy. Perhaps he thought there were safety in numbers, even if he wasn't truly one of Philip's men, as the praying Indians were typically peaceful people. Meanwhile, on August 22, 1675, a few English settlers were murdered in Marlborough. A small group of Indigenous people in service to the English eventually arrested and killed Andrew for the murders, believing him responsible. So is this Andrew the Indian, the one who sold the fishing weir at Forge Pond? Likely it is. While we like to consider our modern borders, looking at a map of historical town borders, one can see that Lancaster once bordered Groton. Andrew's story shows that members of his tribe were often traveling to and around Lancaster. Additionally, considering the history that the Prescotts have in establishing Lancaster and moving to Groton, with the land near the weir, they likely had knowledge of him and that he was the person to do business with by buying the weir. And it was in 1675, 2 years after he sold the weir, that they moved further south. Andrew's presence in the record is brief but powerful. It offers a glimpse of a native man navigating life in a rapidly changing world, engaging in land transactions, participating in the colonial economy, and holding a place in this landscape, even as pressures mounted around him. Let's fast forward several decades. This brings us to the 1764 census that listed 0, quote, Indians living in Westford, Littleton, Groton, and Chelmsford. From the above research, the data would seem to be supported. They either organized into a praying village and were not included in the census, the village being considered something of its own sovereign state, or they all removed to New Hampshire, and the few that stayed behind were described as old and in ill health. By 1788, those left behind would have most likely passed. There was typically a fair amount of miscalculation in early censuses. People were overlooked as the takers turned a blind eye. This was common in the enumeration of enslaved people as well. When the praying villages broke up and the English settlers took over the land, Indigenous people were often left with just a few options: blend into English society by changing their name and way of life, or try to join up with another Indigenous community. Enter James Simons. Our only record of him is in the Westford Town Records of 1788 after his death. Given that the man's name is known to history as James Simons, he most likely assimilated into the English life and was left off of the census. Identifying as a settler and no longer as a native, the census, while it does not tell the whole truth, it also doesn't lie. Leonard Parker was a Parkerville man who was reimbursed by the town for taking care of James. Jonathan Minot was also reimbursed for the coffin he purchased for James's burial. The coffin supports the idea that James was Christian. Given the relationship between the Wamasett and some of the people of Chelmsford, like the Parkers, I think it's likely that James Simons is a descendant of the remaining 10 Wamasett. He either chose or was taken in by the Parkers because of that familiarity. Perhaps oral traditions had been passed down about a friendship between the Parkers and the Wamasetts, and James felt safe in Leonard's care. The Old Pioneer Cemetery is a small, roughly 1,500 square foot lot located at the corner of Carlisle and Old Lowell Roads. This piece of land is easily missed if you aren't looking for it. This is an old burying ground that was used for the Parker and Corey families. Rumor has it that an arm was even once buried there. The cemetery lay unused and neglected for decades until homeowners James and Adele Fahey undertook the task of finding the location of the purported cemetery. Their quest began in 1972, and slowly they cleared enough to discover 6 stone markers in the ground. The cemetery, having been cleared, was rededicated on July 4, 1972. At the ceremony, attended by area residents and the Boston news media, Alistair McDougall told of how Leonard Parker was reimbursed for taking care of James Simons and for his burial. Mr. McDougall felt that James was buried in this cemetery. The Faheys believed They located the burial site through the use of divining rods, and in 1973, a mourning ceremony was held by members of the Indian Cultural Association of Lowell. When I set out to research this subject, I wanted to know about the Indigenous history that took place on the land that is now Westford. I wanted to be able to mark in a spot and say something happened here. However, what I learned is more than I think I ever imagined. This research also took on new weight for me when I found that some of the English settlers mentioned were my own direct ancestors, a connection I wouldn't have made had I not researched this topic. I remember dropping my daughter off at camp, seeing a rock in Tingsboro which marked a location where Wanalancet died, and thinking to myself, that's interesting, and also not quite believing it, as historical markers tend to be riddled with inaccuracies and half-truths. The marker does not and cannot fully tell the heartbreaking story of the men and women who lived here. I wanted to know the story of the Indigenous people who lived on this land. The written record suggests that Indigenous people may not have resided permanently within present-day Westford, but likely used its resources seasonally. There is evidence of Indigenous life near these sources, arrowheads, gauges, fishing weights, and the like, but surveys have not found evidence of wigwams. The archaeological evidence is on the Wamasett purchase land, with little evidence on the Neshoba end of town. Additionally, the Neshoba, quote, boundary was not near the Westford boundary, which does not mean people didn't come to the area, but evidence doesn't support permanent structures. I also assumed the Indigenous history was more likely tied to the Neshoba, but more likely, Westford's history is more closely tied to the Wamasett history. Today, the people most closely linked to the Massachusett tribes still live and gather on their ancestral lands. They are the praying Indians of Natick and Ponkapog, led by Chief Caring Hands. I struggled then to tell the story of Westford's Indigenous history. What actually happened here? Who actually lived here? I still feel I cannot answer those questions definitively. The answer lies within the unwritten historical record, lost from the ledger, and as such, remains once known.